You saw the headline, but you probably didn't see the real story hiding underneath it. On the surface, it sounded simple, almost procedural, as if a geopolitical knot had finally been pulled. Tight by a single decisive statement, Donald Trump claims Nicolas Maduro is captured. The word traveled quickly, stripped of context, framed as clarity after years of ambiguity. Captured by whom exactly was left vague. Captured how and to what end was treated as obvious. And so the official version settled into place. Venezuela's crisis had reached a final stage. Its leadership neutralized, not by invasion or overthrow, but by exposure, pressure, and inevitability. The system, we were told, had finally worked. But this version of events depends on a particular kind of silence. It assumes that power announces itself cleanly, that control is visible when it is effective, and that political collapse happens in discrete, legible moments. It also assumes that words spoken by a former president exist merely as commentary rather than as instruments within a larger structure of influence. When the phrase captured entered the conversation, it did not describe a legal status or a military reality. It described a narrative convenience. The official story suggests a straight line. Years of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, and internal decay, culminating in a leader so constrained that his sovereignty has effectively evaporated. In this telling, the suffering of Venezuelans becomes a tragic but necessary backdrop, and the global system that imposed those constraints is cast as an impatient but rational actor waiting for reality to catch up. What disappears in this version is the machinery itself, the incentives that keep the crisis unresolved, the actors who profit from permanent instability, and the uncomfortable fact that capture does not always mean removal. Often, it means containment. When the claim was amplified by figures like Tucker Carlson, it carried a different weight. Not because it added evidence, but because it added reach. The statement was no longer just an assertion. It became a test of what the audience was willing to accept without asking. How power actually functions when states fail slowly rather than dramatically. Media. Institutions repeated the claim cautiously or avoided it entirely, not out of skepticism alone, but because unpacking it would require confronting a deeper contradiction. If Maduro is already captured, why does the system that claims to have captured him still behave as though it has no exit strategy? This is where the headline begins to fracture. A captured leader should produce outcomes, policy shifts, negotiated transitions, or at least visible concessions. Instead, Venezuela remains suspended in a familiar limbo. Sanctions persist, markets adapt around them, intermediaries grow richer, and the burden disperses downward to workers, migrants, and informal economies that absorb the shock quietly. The discomfort is not that Maduro remains in power, but that his continued presence serves a function. He becomes the justification for policies that no longer aim to resolve the crisis, only to manage it indefinitely. So the question is not whether Maduro is captured. The more unsettling question is who benefits from declaring him. And what it says about a system that calls containment a victory while avoiding the cost of resolution. If this is capture, why does it look so much like stasis? And who exactly is trapped inside it? The second layer of the story begins where the first one becomes uncomfortable to sustain. If capture does not produce change, then the word must be doing a different kind of work. It must be signaling alignment rather than outcome, reassurance rather than resolution. In geopolitical systems, language often moves faster than reality because it is cheaper. Declaring control costs nothing, exercising it costs everything. And so the declaration itself becomes the product. To understand why Venezuela remains frozen in place despite years of pressure, it helps to step away from the personalities involved and look instead at the architecture of constraint that has been built around the country. Sanctions are presented publicly as tools of leverage, temporary measures designed to alter behavior. In practice, they have evolved into a permanent environment. They shape supply chains, financial routing, insurance markets, shipping decisions, and risk calculations far beyond Caracas. Over time, entire industries emerge to navigate around them legal gray zones staffed by lawyers, brokers, and intermediaries who understand how to move capital without technically violating the rules. These actors do not need the crisis to end. They need it to remain predictable. This is where the idea of capture becomes inverted. The Venezuelan state is constrained, but so are the governments imposing the constraints. Once a sanctions regime reaches a certain scale, reversing it becomes politically costly, lifting pressure without a clear victory, risks being framed as weakness or capitulation. Maintaining pressure, on the other hand, can be justified indefinitely by pointing to the absence of reform. The result is a self-reinforcing loop. Sanctions remain because conditions have not improved, and conditions do not improve because sanctions remain. Inside this loop, responsibility becomes diffuse. Economic collapse is blamed on mismanagement, corruption, or ideology, while external pressure is described as merely revealing underlying flaws. This framing allows policymakers to distance themselves from downstream consequences, hyperinflation, mass migration, the hollowing out of institutions while still claiming moral consistency. The suffering becomes evidence of necessity rather than failure. What rarely enters the mainstream discussion is how this system redistributes risk. The political leadership absorbs rhetorical blame but retains practical leverage over domestic resources and coercive power. International actors absorb none of the material cost of collapse. That cost is transferred instead to ordinary citizens, to neighboring countries, absorbing migrants, and to informal economies that expand precisely because formal ones have been suffocated. In this sense, capture does not remove power, it reorganizes it. Media discomfort around this reality is not accidental. Acknowledging that sanctions function as long-term structural constraints rather than short-term bargaining chips would require admitting that there is no clean endpoint. It would force a reckoning with the fact that the system is not waiting for a breakthrough. It is operating exactly as designed. Stability in this context does not mean recovery. It means containment without escalation. So when figures confidently state that Maduro is already captured, they are not describing a fact on the ground. They are reaffirming a narrative that allows the machinery to keep running without scrutiny. The deeper question, avoided precisely because it has no easy answer, is whether a system that depends on permanent crisis can ever claim to be working, and what happens when the language of control becomes indistinguishable from an admission of stalemate. The third layer emerges when we look beyond the mechanics of sanctions and into the political economy they quietly reshape. Over time, prolonged isolation does not simply weaken a state. It changes who the state is accountable to. When access to global markets narrows, governments stop governing for growth and begin governing for survival. Revenue no longer depends on broad-based economic participation, but on narrow channels that can be controlled, monitored, and defended. Oil exports routed through intermediaries, currency exchanges operating in legal shadows, and selective enforcement of regulations become tools of governance rather than symptoms of collapse. In this environment, the distinction between corruption and strategy blurs. What appears externally as dysfunction often functions internally as consolidation. scarcity becomes a lever. Access to basic goods, foreign currency, and exit routes is mediated through political loyalty or informal networks. The more restricted the system becomes, the fewer actors are capable of navigating it and the more valuable their position inside it becomes. This is not an accident of failure. It is a predictable adaptation to pressure. The idea that a leader under such conditions is captured misunderstands how power behaves when legitimacy erodes but control remains. Capture implies loss of agency. What Venezuela demonstrates instead is a reallocation of agency away from public institutions and toward opaque structures that are harder to target precisely because they are informal. The state does not disappear, it fragments, and those fragments are often more resilient than the centralized systems that preceded them. External observers tend to measure success by visible indicators: elections held or canceled, protests suppressed or tolerated, statements issued or withdrawn. But the more consequential shifts happen quietly. Military and security elites gain economic roles. Borders become revenue streams. Migration itself becomes a pressure valve that reduces internal unrest while exporting instability outward. Each of these outcomes can be condemned rhetorically while still serving the immediate interests of those in power. This is where international discomfort deepens. If sanctions have not removed the leadership and have instead contributed to a more insulated ruling structure, then the moral clarity of the policy begins to erode. Admitting this would mean confronting an uncomfortable that pressure, once applied, can entrench precisely the dynamics it was meant to dismantle. Yet reversing course would require acknowledging responsibility for second and third-order effects that were never publicly modeled. So the narrative persists. The leader is isolated. The regime is weak. Collapse is imminent. These claims allow distance to be maintained between cause and consequence. They also allow time to pass without reassessment. In this way, capture becomes less a description of Venezuela's condition than a reflection of how external systems manage their own accountability. If the crisis is framed as already resolved in principle, then its continuation can be treated as a local anomaly rather than a systemic outcome. The unresolved tension at the end of this layer is not about Venezuela's future alone. It is about whether a global order that relies on prolonged economic coercion can recognize when its tools stop producing change and start producing permanence, and what it means when no actor involved is incentivized to admit the difference. The fourth layer becomes visible when we follow the crisis outward, beyond Venezuela's borders, and observe how its consequences are absorbed elsewhere without ever being formally attributed to the policies that helped produce them. Mass migration is usually described as a humanitarian outcome, a tragic but secondary effect of domestic failure. In reality, it is one of the central stabilizing mechanisms of prolonged economic pressure. When millions leave, they reduce internal demand, lower the immediate risk of unrest, and transform political crisis into a regional management problem rather than a domestic one. Neighboring countries become buffers. Their labor markets absorb displaced workers at lower wages. Their social services stretch quietly under the strain. Their political systems inherit tensions they did not create. Yet this redistribution of pressure rarely feeds back into the original policy debate. Migration is treated as evidence of regime failure, not as a structural response to externally reinforced scarcity. The system externalizes its costs and then points to those costs as validation. At the same time, global energy and commodity markets adapt in ways that further complicate the notion of capture. Venezuelan oil does not simply vanish. It reappears under different labels through different routes, discounted to reflect risk and opacity. These discounts benefit buyers willing to operate in gray zones and traders capable of arbitrage. The inefficiency is not eliminated, it is monetized. A crisis economy creates its own ecosystem of profit, one that thrives on uncertainty and has little interest in normalization. This is where the silence from major institutions becomes more telling than any statement. International financial bodies issue reports heavy on diagnosis and light on agency. Governments acknowledge humanitarian concerns while renewing restrictive measures with minor adjustments. Media coverage spikes during moments of spectacle elections, protests, diplomatic confrontations, and then recedes, leaving the underlying structure untouched. The absence of sustained attention is not neglect, it is fatigue managed into acceptance. Within this context, calling the situation a capture serves another function. It reassures domestic audiences in sanctioning countries that the policy has already succeeded in. Principle, if the objective has been achieved conceptually, then ongoing suffering can be framed as a residual process rather than an active failure. This reframing reduces political pressure to revisit assumptions or measure outcomes against original goals. The system is no longer accountable for change, only for consistency. The uncomfortable question that begins to surface here is whether the crisis persists because it is unsolvable or because it has become useful. A permanently constrained state provides a cautionary example, a moral narrative, and a controlled source of instability that can be managed but not resolved. It allows global actors to demonstrate resolve without bearing the full cost of reconstruction or reconciliation. And so the tension tightens. If Venezuela's condition now stabilizes regional and global arrangements rather than disrupting them, then who exactly is invested in breaking the cycle? At what point does the language of capture reveal less about the target and more about a system that has learned how to live comfortably with unresolved collapse? The fifth layer forces a confrontation with something even less discussed, the ideological comfort that prolonged crises provide to those observing from a distance. Venezuela is no longer treated as a country in motion, but as a fixed reference point, a case study frozen in time. It functions as a warning, a rhetorical anchor used to validate broader economic and political positions elsewhere. In this role, its complexity becomes inconvenient. Nuance would weaken the utility of the example. When political actors describe Venezuela, they rarely describe it as it is now. They describe what it represents. For some, it is the inevitable endpoint of state intervention. For others, it is proof of external sabotage. Both narratives simplify the same reality, and both depend on the crisis remaining unresolved. Resolution would force a recalibration of arguments built around it. Stalemate preserves ideological clarity. This is where the concept of capture takes on a symbolic dimension. Declaring a leader captured allows critics to claim vindication without confronting the harder work, reconstruction. It implies that history has already rendered its verdict, even if reality has not followed suit. The gap between narrative closure and lived experience widens, but it is rarely interrogated because doing so would destabilize the frameworks that rely on Venezuela as an illustrative extreme. Inside Venezuela, this external fixation has consequences. Policy space narrows not only because of material constraints, but because international expectations harden. Any deviation from the established script is treated with suspicion. Partial reforms are dismissed as cosmetic. Engagement is framed as legitimization. The country becomes trapped between an external audience that demands purity and an internal system that has adapted to isolation. The possibility of imperfect, incremental change is crowded out. The economic structure reflects this paralysis. Informality is no longer a temporary adaptation, but a dominant mode of survival. Long-term investment becomes irrational when normalization is perpetually postponed. Human capital drains away, not only through migration, but through disengagement. People stop planning, institutions stop promising, the future contracts into a series of short-term calculations, each one rational in isolation and devastating in aggregate. From the outside, this stagnation is interpreted as confirmation. The system is broken, therefore pressure must continue. But this logic ignores a critical asymmetry. The actors advocating continuation do not bear the cost of the time they demand. Years pass differently for those living inside constrained systems than for those managing them from afar. Delay is not neutral. It accumulates damage quietly. By this stage, the idea that the crisis has already been decided, captured, concluded, morally settled, becomes a way to avoid grappling with the irreversible effects of waiting. If the outcome is assumed, then the present can be tolerated, but the unresolved tension remains sharp. If Venezuela's role in global discourse is more valuable as an unresolved example than as a recovering society, what incentive exists to change the conditions that keep it that way? The sixth layer comes into focus when we examine how narratives of control interact with domestic politics far from Venezuela itself. Statements about capture are rarely aimed at Caracas. They are aimed inward toward audiences who want reassurance that complex foreign policy choices have produced moral clarity. In this sense, Venezuela becomes a mirror rather than a subject, reflecting back the self-image of those speaking about it. For political figures, especially in polarized environments, foreign crises offer a rare outcomes can be asserted without being immediately tested. Domestic voters do not experience the consequences directly. There are no factories closing overnight, no visible tax increases, no soldiers returning home. This distance allows certainty to replace evidence. A leader can declare success without having to manage aftermath. Media ecosystems reinforce this dynamic. Long-term structural failures do not translate well into daily cycles. They lack novelty. They resist personalization. As a result, coverage gravitates toward declarative moments, arrests rumored, negotiations announced, threats issued, while the underlying continuity fades into the background. Over time, the audience is trained to accept stasis as normal and declarations as sufficient. This is why discomfort emerges whenever the narrative is challenged. Questioning whether Venezuela is truly captured threatens to reopen debates that have been politically closed. It invites scrutiny of cost-benefit calculations that were never publicly articulated. It raises the possibility that policies justified as temporary have become permanent fixtures without democratic renewal. Silence in this context is not ignorance. It is risk management. There is also a strategic ambiguity at work. If Venezuela is framed as already neutralized, then escalation can be avoided without appearing weak. If it is framed as still dangerous, pressure can be maintained without escalation. The ambiguity allows flexibility while shielding decision makers from accountability. Capture becomes a rhetorical holding pattern. Meanwhile, the global system continues to absorb the consequences in diffuse ways. Migration reshapes demographics. Informal trade networks entrench norms around. Sovereignty erodes selectively. Each effect is manageable in isolation, but together they signal a shift toward a world where unresolved crises are normalized as a form of governance. Control is exercised not through resolution, but through endurance. The tension at this stage is subtle but profound. If political language is increasingly used to declare outcomes that structures do not deliver, then where does legitimacy reside? At what point does the repetition of success narratives weaken trust rather than reinforce it? And how many unresolved cases like Venezuela can the system sustain before the distance between words and reality becomes impossible to ignore? The seventh layer confronts the final implication of this dynamic. What prolonged, managed failure does to the credibility of power itself. Systems that rely on endurance rather than resolution eventually reveal their limits, not through collapse, but through erosion. Authority weakens quietly when its declarations no longer correspond to observable change. Each assertion that reality has already been decided makes the absence of that reality harder to ignore. In this context, Venezuela is less an exception than a preview. It illustrates how modern power often prefers containment to transformation, ambiguity to closure. The tools designed for leverage become instruments of delay. The language meant to signal strength becomes a substitute for action. Over time, this redefines what success looks like. Victory is no longer measured by outcomes achieved, but by crises prevented from spiraling out of control. The bar lowers slowly and almost imperceptibly. For populations watching from the outside, this shift produces confusion rather than outrage. If leaders are captured, if regimes are isolated, if pressure is working, then why do the same headlines repeat year after year with only minor variations? The dissonance does not immediately provoke resistance. It produces resignation. Complex systems benefit from this. Fatigue. A disengaged audience asks fewer questions. Inside Venezuela, the effects are even more corrosive. When the outside world speaks as if the story is already finished, internal actors lose incentives to imagine alternatives. Opposition movements fracture under the weight of expectations they cannot meet. Compromise is framed as betrayal. Maximalist demands persist precisely because there is no cost to maintaining them from afar. The space for pragmatic negotiation narrows until it disappears. This is where the idea of capture reveals its final contradiction. If a leader were truly captured in any meaningful sense, leverage would be converted into transition. Pressure would be exchanged for guarantees. Sanctions would be tools, not environments. The absence of these steps suggests not hidden success, but institutional paralysis. The system knows how to apply pressure, but not how to unwind it without admitting uncertainty. What remains unresolved is not simply Venezuela's fate, but the question of whether global power structures are capable of moving beyond indefinite management. If every complex crisis is allowed to harden into permanence, then the language of control loses its meaning. Capture becomes a word used to mask the inability to conclude. As this layer closes, the unease is no longer confined to one country. It extends to the architecture of international authority itself. If power can no longer deliver endings, only extensions, then what exactly is being exercised and how long can credibility survive on declarations alone? The eighth and final layer brings the story back to where it began, not to resolve it, but to expose the cost of pretending it already has been. When a former president declares a foreign leader captured, the statement sounds definitive because it borrows the language of conclusion. It implies that the arc has bent, that leverage has converted into outcome, that history is merely catching up. But what Venezuela reveals, when examined without the comfort of slogans, is a system that has replaced endings with maintenance. This is the deeper reality that rarely enters the headline. Power, in its contemporary form, often functions less like a decisive force and more like a regulatory environment. It constrains behavior, shapes incentives, and limits deviation, but it struggles to produce closure. The Venezuelan crisis has become a managed condition contained enough to avoid escalation, unresolved enough to avoid responsibility for reconstruction. In that space, declarations of capture serve a psychological function. They reassure those speaking that the moral ledger is balanced, even as material conditions remain unchanged. The danger of this approach is not that it fails loudly, but that it succeeds quietly at redefining expectations Audiences grow accustomed to crises without conclusions. Policymakers grow accustomed to policies without exits. Language drifts further from reality, and the gap is normalized rather than challenged. Over time, the credibility of institutions is not shattered, it thins, stretched across too many unresolved claims. Venezuela, in this sense, is not a closed chapter, but a warning embedded in plain sight. It shows what happens when systems optimize for avoiding embarrassment rather than achieving resolution, for sustaining pressure rather than designing transitions. It exposes how easily moral certainty can coexist with practical paralysis and how readily suffering can be absorbed into abstractions about strategy and resolve. So the real question hiding beneath the headline is not whether Maduro is captured. It is whether a global order that relies on indefinite containment can still recognize the difference between control and conclusion. If power can describe outcomes it cannot deliver, and if those descriptions are accepted as sufficient, then the capture that matters may not be happening in Caracas at all. It may be happening in the language we use, the standards we accept, and the quiet agreement to treat unfinished crises as settled stories until one day the accumulation of unresolved realities demands an answer that declarations can no longer provide.